In 2026, when analysts ask why China would defend or strongly support Iran if it were attacked, the answer does not begin with ideology. It begins with calculation. It begins with geography. It begins with energy, trade routes, and the long game of global power. Imagine a map stretching from East Asia across Central Asia down to the Persian Gulf. That corridor is not abstract. It carries oil. It carries gas. It carries shipping lanes that keep factories running in Shanghai and Shenzhen. Iran sits at a crossroads of that map. It borders the Persian Gulf, overlooks the Strait of Hormuz, and connects land routes toward Europe and the Mediterranean. From Beijing's perspective, that is not just a country. That is a strategic hinge. Energy is the first and most obvious layer. China is one of the world's largest energy consumers. Its industrial machine depends heavily on imported oil. Over the past decade, especially under U.S. sanctions on Iran, Chinese refiners have quietly remained significant buyers of Iranian crude, often through discounted arrangements. For China, Iran represents not just supply, but leverage. Iranian oil is often sold below market price due to sanctions pressure. That discount matters. In an era of global economic slowdown and competition with the United States, cheaper energy strengthens China's manufacturing advantage. But it is deeper than barrels of oil. If Iran were destabilized through major war, especially one that closed or threatened the Strait of Hormuz, global oil prices would spike dramatically. That shock would hit China hard. The strait carries roughly a fifth of global oil trade. If conflict spread, shipping insurance would soar, tankers would reroute, prices would jump, inflation would rise inside China. Beijing's leaders understand that domestic stability depends partly on predictable energy flows. So when they signal support for Iran's sovereignty, they are also signaling defense of their own economic security. Now step back and look at the geopolitical chessboard. Since the early 2000s, the United States has maintained military dominance in the Gulf. U.S. bases stretch from Bahrain to Qatar to Kuwait. From Beijing's view, Iran is one of the few regional powers not aligned with Washington. That alone makes it strategically significant. Not because China and Iran are natural allies, but because both share a common concern: U.S. hegemony. If Iran were militarily crushed or politically replaced with a pro-Western government, the balance of power in the Middle East would tilt further toward Washington and its allies. For China, that would mean less room to maneuver in energy diplomacy, less access to discounted resources, and greater vulnerability to American pressure. Beijing does not want regime change scenarios led by the U.S. to become normalized. It worries that such precedents could one day be applied elsewhere, even in Asia. There is also the Belt and Road Initiative. Iran plays a key role in China's westward connectivity plans. Rail corridors linking China to Europe can pass through Central Asia into Iran and onward to Turkey. Ports in the Persian Gulf offer maritime access points. In 2021, China and Iran signed a long-term strategic cooperation agreement reportedly spanning 25 years, involving infrastructure, energy, and investment. While not all details are public, the symbolism matters. It signals long-term alignment. It tells the world that China sees Iran as part of its Eurasian integration vision. We are in 2026. The global system is more fragmented than it was a decade ago. The rivalry between China and the United States has intensified over technology, Taiwan, trade, and military presence in the Indo-Pacific. In that context, Iran becomes a secondary theater in a much larger contest. By supporting Iran diplomatically at the United Nations, or economically through trade mechanisms that bypass sanctions, China demonstrates resistance to U.S.-led isolation strategies. But does China truly want war in defense of Iran? That is where nuance enters. Beijing's foreign policy traditionally avoids direct military entanglements. It prefers economic leverage and diplomatic balancing. If Iran were attacked, China would likely first respond through strong diplomatic condemnation, calls for ceasefire, and perhaps economic support. Direct military intervention would be far less likely unless core Chinese assets were directly threatened. Still, deterrence works through signaling. When China deepens military cooperation with Iran, conducts joint naval drills, or coordinates positions with Russia at the UN Security Council, it sends a message: Iran is not isolated. That signal complicates any adversary's calculations. It raises the political cost of escalation. Another layer is multipolarity. China has repeatedly advocated for a multipolar world order. In simple terms, that means a world not dominated by a single superpower. Iran, under sanctions and pressure from Western states, fits into China's broader narrative of resisting unilateralism. By defending Iran's right to economic engagement, China reinforces its own argument that sanctions should not be weaponized to dictate political outcomes. There is also the technological dimension. In recent years, cooperation between China and Iran has expanded into telecommunications, surveillance technology, and infrastructure development. For Chinese companies restricted in Western markets, sanctioned states sometimes become alternative partners. This creates interdependence. If Iran collapses under military assault, those investments become vulnerable. Let's move to the security perspective. Iran sits near Central Asia, a region China views as strategically sensitive due to its proximity to Xinjiang. Instability spilling northward could create refugee flows, extremist movements, or trafficking routes that indirectly affect China's western provinces. Beijing prefers stable, predictable governments along its western frontier. Even if Iran is ideologically different, it is a functioning state. Chaos is worse. At sea, the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea are critical for maritime trade routes linking China to Europe and Africa. China has expanded its naval presence in the Indian Ocean over the past decade. Protecting sea lanes is central to its long-term naval doctrine. If Iran were attacked in a way that destabilized maritime routes, Chinese shipping interests would be exposed. Therefore, preventing large-scale war aligns with China's strategic doctrine of safeguarding trade corridors. Now consider domestic politics inside China. The Chinese Communist Party places immense emphasis on sovereignty and non-interference. This principle is not purely moral, it is protective. Beijing fears external support for separatist movements in places like Taiwan, Tibet, or Xinjiang. Therefore, when it defends Iran against what it frames as external aggression, it reinforces a global norm that governments should not be overthrown by outside force. That consistency strengthens China's own position against foreign criticism. There is also economic pragmatism. Iran, with a population of over 85 million, represents a significant market for Chinese goods, from consumer electronics to automobiles. As Western companies reduce presence due to sanctions, Chinese firms often fill gaps. War would destroy purchasing power, disrupt contracts, and damage infrastructure financed by Chinese banks. But let's be honest, China's support is not unconditional. Beijing balances relationships carefully. It maintains strong trade ties with Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. It has deepened economic relations with Israel as well, especially in technology sectors. China does not want to choose sides permanently. It wants access to all markets. That balancing act is delicate. In fact, in 2023, China brokered a diplomatic rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That move signaled a new ambition, not just trading partner, but mediator. By positioning itself as a peacemaker, China increases prestige and reduces the risk of regional war that could disrupt its interests. So when people ask whether China would defend Iran, the more accurate answer may be that China would defend stability, defend energy flows, defend multipolarity, and defend its strategic investments. Because geopolitics is not just steel and oil, it is perception. If China allowed a close partner like Iran to be decisively weakened without response, other countries might question the reliability of Chinese partnerships. From Africa to Southeast Asia, Beijing promotes itself as a long-term, dependable partner who does not abandon friends under pressure. Credibility matters in international relations. Even limited diplomatic backing reinforces that image. Then there is the Russia factor. Iran has strengthened ties with Russia, particularly in defense cooperation. China and Russia, while not formal allies, coordinate strategically in opposition to U.S. dominance. If Iran were attacked in a way that pulled Russia deeper into confrontation, China would face complex calculations. Supporting Iran indirectly could also mean maintaining alignment with Moscow in a broader anti-hegemonic framework. Technology sanctions add another dimension. The U.S. has imposed export controls on advanced semiconductors targeting China. In response, China has sought alternative trade networks less dependent on Western systems. Iran, already outside the Western financial system, fits into experiments with alternative payment mechanisms, including yuan-based transactions. A stable Iran supports diversification away from dollar dominance, yet it is important not to exaggerate. China is cautious. It avoids ideological entanglement. It prefers gradual expansion of influence rather than dramatic confrontation. If Iran initiated aggressive actions that threatened regional war, Beijing would likely urge restraint rather than endorse escalation. Its core objective is not to empower Iranian ideology, but to protect Chinese interests. So why would China defend Iran if attacked? Because energy security is existential for its economy. Because preventing U.S.-led regime change aligns with its global strategy. Because Belt and Road corridors depend on Iranian geography. Because maritime trade routes must remain open. Because multipolarity strengthens Beijing's bargaining power. Because credibility in partnerships builds long-term influence. And because instability in West Asia creates ripple effects that eventually reach East Asia. Now imagine the opposite scenario. Iran collapses into prolonged war. The Gulf burns. Oil hits record highs. Shipping lanes are mined. Refugees flood neighboring states. Extremist networks exploit chaos. U.S. military presence expands dramatically. Under that scenario, China's Western connectivity plans suffer. Its energy bills rise. Its diplomatic narrative weakens. From Beijing's vantage point, defending Iran diplomatically and economically is cheaper than absorbing those consequences. In 2026, global politics is not about permanent alliances, it is about intersecting interests. China does not share Iran's political system. It does not share its revolutionary ideology. But it shares a desire to limit U.S. unilateral influence. It shares concern about sanctions as tools of coercion. It shares interest in stable trade routes. That convergence, not emotional solidarity, explains the partnership. And so the answer is not romantic. It is strategic. China would defend Iran not out of brotherhood, but out of balance. Not out of shared faith, but shared calculation. Not because Tehran commands Beijing, but because geography, oil, trade, and power align in a moment where neither wants to see the other fall under external force. In geopolitics, friendship is secondary, interest is primary. And in that equation, Iran matters deeply to China's long-term vision of a world where power is distributed, supply chains are secure, and no single state dictates the rules. That is the real core of it. Slow, deliberate, strategic calculation. Energy, roots, multipolarity, stability, and the quiet understanding that in a fragmented 2026 world, protecting a partner can mean protecting yourself.